Overextension in EU4. Overextension is caused by owning provinces on which you do not hold a core. Importantly, overextension does not apply to provinces that started the game as uncolonized. You gain 80 overextension for every 100 development that satisfies the above two conditions. Overextension goes away when you either core the province or stop directly controlling the province. This is usually achieved by either finishing the cores in the province in question or releasing a vassal in your newly conquered territories. Another important thing to bear in mind with overextension is the events that can be triggered while you have over 100 overextension. If you have over 100 overextension, you qualify for a wonderful selection of events that, among other things, take away your stability, legitimacy, manpower, diplomatic power, and even some advisors. Hence, this is something that you should be aware of in your campaign. This description should be enough for 99% of the cases where you encounter it, but if you want a more in-depth explanation, feel free to stick around for the rest of the video. Okay, if you're still here, welcome. If you're feeling up to it, a like and a sub would be appreciated. But with the selfishing out the way, let's continue. So, overextension, one of those mechanics that is meant to prevent you from annexing half of India for breakfast and finishing off Europe by dinner. Its effects are certainly substantial, even excluding the events, but given the existence of true one-tag world conquests by 1472, clearly overextension can at least be managed. So, let's talk about the effects of overextension question, before we get into the events. We're going to be discussing the direct effects of it, the scaling ones. The effects of 100 overextension can be seen on screen here, but bear in mind these are all scalars. A level of overextension at 10% gives you a tenth of these effects, and likewise 1000 overextension gives you this but times 10. If only stacking positive modifiers was as easy as stacking overextension, but I digress. Let's go through these with the assumption that you're going for the single player world conquest. And we begin right away with the big one, national unrest. When you get overextension in the early game, this is going to sting. A lot of provinces will take this opportunity to rise up, which is usually made worse by the fact that you probably get the overextension in question by fighting. So you either have low or at least reduced manpower reserves. However, once you hit around 200 or even 300 overextension, you enter a routine of sorts. Namely, provinces that are going to rise up are going to rise up. You stab the rebels, they get the recent uprising modifier, and you keep going with your life. As such, weirdly enough, this unrest, while annoying, will become less directly impactful past 200%. AKA the part where you accept, okay, the provinces will keep rising up, I'm gonna bear that in mind. Now this modifier does come into play again with 2000% overextension, as at that point overextension effects of unrest hit plus 100, and as such you tend to nullify the recent uprising. This means that now, congratulations, it starts to matter a lot again. At this point, just have around 75% of your army on permanent, what do I even want to call it? I know, conflict resolution workshops. Yes, assign around 75% of your army onto conflict resolution workshops, and you should be fine. Be mindful of the manpower drain that occurs from this, as this conflict is literally going to be in 99% of your country at this point, and it's going to be significantly worse fighting the rebels in terms of manpower drain than fighting pretty much every other country out there. Now, stability cost modifier. This one honestly just sucks too. This will end up costing you admin points, and hence I would recommend increasing your stability as little as possible while you have overextension. This also scales quite badly. With over 1000 overextension, you're looking at 500% stability cost, or 600 admin points per stability point. This is the time I have to go ahead and mention the power of Catholicism. See, with that, you can go speak to the Pope and ask him to beautify a local saint, which will give you a free stat point. What's nice about this is that the cost to do this does not scale with your overextension. It's always going to be 100 papal influence, or less if you have any abilities that reduce the cost. So, hey, it's a good way to get +1 stability. Bear in mind though, you can't be at war with the Pope if you plan to use this, but it's a good way of avoiding paying 600 admin or the equivalent of an admin technology on a stat. The thing that's important to bear in mind with stability though is that the effects of -3 stability are not actually that substantial. And honestly, I would recommend just sitting on -3 stability if it wasn't for one relatively major drawback. See, when you have -3 stability, you lose the ability to declare new wars, so you have to stab up to at least -2. And therefore, that's kind of where it comes into play. But I'll be honest, +6 unrest from -3 stability is not the end of the world when you already have thousands of overextension. Either way, this is one of those modifiers that I have to concede is kind of bad from the overextension list. Now we get to trade power abroad. It's a fun one. Basically, on your home nodes, or nodes where you have a majority trade power, this means nothing. What this, however, does do is destroy your ability to steal trade from other nations. So in this case, for example, we are here loaded up as France. We have a couple home nodes, Champagne, we have a home node of Bordeaux, so far so good. Let's say, however, we have this merchant in the Rhineland. Now, this is not our home node. We don't even own a province in there. So this is about the definition of trade power abroad, as good as it gets. The trade power we're going to be having here is going to be absolutely nuked by the overextension we have. In fact, minus 100%. And the month tick hasn't actually occurred for it to be, in apply here, because I've just loaded up 100% overextension. If we give this a month tick, you'll see this go from 42% into pretty much 0. Yeah, we're at 6.8. Now, something to bear in mind with this is that once you get 100 overextension, you start going over 100% extension. Anything past minus 100% reduction is cosmetic. Reducing your 50 caravan power, 50 trade power by 100% has the same effect as reducing it by 20,000%. The final answer is going to be pretty much 0 anyway. Next thing on the list, mercenary cost. In the early game, it can be a bit annoying. It can also be something to be mindful of if you had just finished conquering some land, you've gained overextension, and you fought the war with mercenaries, so you still have those mercenaries hired. Be careful with that. Those mercenaries are going to jump up in price. But it's not too substantial, so it's manageable, for lack of a better word. Most of the times when you're hitting the ridiculous thousands of overextension, when you're doing your single-player world conquests, it's going to sting a lot more, that's for sure, but two things happen there that make this modifier relevant. Firstly, you're not even remotely reliant on mercenaries as you are in the early game, in terms of manpower, well, conservation. You just tend to have enough manpower. So having a ridiculous amount of mercenary cost when you're not using mercenaries is, well, relevant. Furthermore, the other thing that works against it is in the super late game, you tend to have scaled an economy, you tend to have your end nodes sorted, or at least your trade sorted, you tend to be making a lot of money. Since you have to go build courthouses everywhere, you have to go run level 5 advisors, there's a lot of things to be spending money on. And since that creates pressure to spend money, it also creates pressure to make a lot of money. So if you do even end up being forced to use mercenaries at 1000% overextension, you tend to be able to afford them anyway. Like, yes, it'll force a couple extra loans out of you, but that's about it. Next on our list, we have diplomatic reputation. So, turns out annexing Europe on a friendly stroll through the garden does not make your life easier for your diplomats. For this, all I will say is make sure you finished annexing all your vassals by the time you start going for the over 1000 overextension stuff. Otherwise, you won't be able to make it. It's another thing to be mindful as well of overextension, in terms of dip rep, because there's a double whammy effect for things like the Eu4 Emperor. You are unable to pass, not unable to pass reforms. It's a lot harder for you to pass reforms while you have overextension, and it's a lot harder for you to pass reforms while you have low dip rep. So overextension kind of does a double whammy of preventing you passing HRE reforms. Be very mindful of that if you're doing that. Another thing to bear in mind as well with overextension is if you are in the process of annexing a vassal, this is going to make it a lot longer. So, again, something to be mindful of. But when you start hitting the 10,000 overextension counts, well, you don't tend to hit 10,000. Normally, I don't think there's much point going above 3,000, 2,000 unless you're just flexing. You're just not going to have any dip rep. That's something you're going to have to accept. And another thing you're going to have to accept is the improved relations. But again, in the early game, that's very important. Minus 50% improved relations for 100 overextension is very substantial, because that also affects your AE decay, and AE decay is something you do care about in the early game when you're doing for your single player runs. As such, you want to minimize your actual overextension over the year tick when the AE takes into account. But again, past 1550, two things are going to start happening to you. You're going to be at a point where you're big enough where you don't care about coalitions. And you're also going to be at a point where you're starting to gear up to take a hegemony. Once that hegemony does happen, everyone's going to hate you. Like, literally everyone's going to hate you. So there's no point taking improved relations. You're not going to be able to make them like you anyway. But again, it's something to be mindful of in the early game. But come late game, it kind of disappears as a problem, since you just accept that everyone's going to hate you. And finally, yearly corruption. Unfortunately, this one's going to somewhat go into the category of national unrest and stab cost modifier. This one's going to be bad. At 100 overextension, you can just root it out. For example, right now, as France, we're paying 10 ducats, no, that's our army, 6 ducats a month to make sure we just are not gaining corruption. Not the end of the world. So, at 200% overextension, this is going to set us back 12.94 ducats. It's substantial in terms of money, but bear in mind again, your single player, your world conquesting, you're going to have a lot of money to spend on this. The issue with the corruption generation is once you go above 200%, you're going to be generating more yearly corruption than you are going to be able to root out from conventional measures. With that said, there are a couple other things you can use to mitigate its impact further. Corruption on its lower levels builds up relatively slowly, but it shouldn't be neglected. So one of the ways you can address that is being ahead of time in admin tech or dip tech, as this will decrease, give you some yearly corruption tick as well from that. But in general, it's just something you're going to have to suck up. The only thing that I can say that's good with corruption is that if you are doing something like 5k overextension as you blitz your way through the EU4 map, well, the good news there is you're going to run out of map before you start hitting genuinely problematic levels of corruption. If this is something that you're actually struggling with in your runs, so you're able to manage the national unrest, you're able to manage the stab cost, but the corruption starts to add up and become genuinely problematic, I would recommend trying a world conquest with a Muslim face, so Shia or Sunni. Usually Sunni because they tend to be more of them around, but Shia also works, or Ibadi if you're feeling fancy, and going legalism. With that, you're able to get two things going for you. With high legalism, you can decrease your corruption by 2 flat when it starts to build up, which is going to be very helpful for you. Another thing to bear in mind with yearly corruption increases from that is Muslim religions get this event, or should be on the screen here, where you have the option to lose to corruption by saying that only traitors have anything to fear. And this is going to be able to counter any of this build-up corruption that you have and you can be struggling with. So it's manageable, but again, it's something that can't be ignored, and this is one of those things that scales very badly when you start doing the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 overextension things. Finally, this is not mentioned on the list because it doesn't apply here, but if you have revolutionary mechanics, the Secretariat is going to gain more influence, and the guild's influence will also increase. This is kind of whatever. You can spend mana to get the faction you want if that really matters for you, but most of the time that can just be ignored. It's a small modifier buff, not many reasons to have a faction, unless you want to get a government reform that requires a certain faction power, in which case, yeah, it's going to cost you a couple extra mana to get the faction you want in charge. So that was the rundown of the direct effects of overextension, but now let's talk about the events. The vast majority of the overextension events are something called pulse events, and the trigger for the pulse events is having overextension on at least 100. So 99 overextension is fine, 100 is not. These events are bad, but manageable. You can get used to them. So let's go through it. The +1 war exhaustion and manpower one is bad. You lose half a year of manpower, and +1 war exhaustion never helps you. But overall, I find it to be not the end of the world, especially since this is a kind of event that gets worse if you have it fire a lot of times. It's going to be very unlucky for you to fire it, say, 5 times in a row. In fact, very improbable. The stab hit one is next, and this one is certainly annoying, but at least it won't happen when you're at -3, so that's nice. But yeah, this one sucks, there's no way around it. Stab hits are very expensive to address when you have a high amount of overextension as previously mentioned, so it's just bad. On the topic of bad things, bad reputation is whatever. Getting prestige to set at 100 is very doable, so it ends up being a temporary setback most of the time. Great projects are helpful for that. A bunch of them give you some prestige if you go for it. You can also get a prestige advisor if you're really struggling. But I've never really had an issue with maintaining 100 prestige come late game. The next one we're talking about is inflation. Inflation, again, isn't that bad because the event only gives you +1 inflation, which in the grand scheme of things isn't that much. I mean, it's annoying at most, but if inflation does start to get out of hand, you've been taking a lot of debt, etc., and you're starting to look at something like 15% inflation, you can just take a mini quick break from your conquest and burn down a couple of hundred admin points for fixing the inflation equation. And while it's punishing, I mean, you're literally forced to stop your expansion. It's not really game-ending inflation. It just makes everything more expensive, so it's certainly bad. You should aim to get rid of it, but at the end of the day, it's rarely going to actually end your game, and once you have got rid of it, well, you've got rid of it. The event for Army Tradition is honestly whatever. You're sieging a lot, and as you may or may not know, you gain Army Tradition from a successful siege on a equal level fort, and as such, you're going to be able to recover that Army Tradition quite quickly. Furthermore, since you're expanding, you're probably gaining Army Tradition from winning battles too. Although I will have to admit that once you start getting big, that Army Tradition is going to become significantly less expandable, since it's the amount of troops you've lost based on your total force limit, and you're not going to be losing that many troops. The worst comes to worst, you do run out of Army Tradition. Oh no. But 0 Army Tradition isn't exactly giving you debuffs, it's just making your army not as good as it can be. The Merchants Presented event should be celebrated, as this means you can't get a different pulse event, and a loss of some trade power combined with some ducats is one of the least relevant things you can pick up in here. The same as for the next one, where your merchant gets relocated from a cannon. Not the end of the world. Next, legitimacy questioned. At most, it's annoying, but again, recoverable. So legitimacy and horde unity, depending on how you're approaching your run, is important, should not be neglected, but it's not the end of the world. It's a setback at most. It's not great, it's not trivial like the other ones, but it's also not a major debuff. Another event you're going to get is Magistrate Resigns, and this one, honestly, I'm going to have to say is quite bad depending on your timing. minus 50 dip is not great before you get the Imperialism CB, since you'll need dip for the unlawful demands. But usually, on its own, minus 50 dip power is not the end of the world. Once you do, however, get to Imperialism CB, so you start using that to go ham on the planet, everything becomes lawful demands unless you take a non-co-belligerent land. So the dip becomes significantly less important from personal experience, doing this myself. So that event goes from, oh no, I'm going to be out of dip yet again, to, I'm pretty good on dip anyway. Advisor resigns can be annoying, but thankfully, much like working for somewhere like Facebook, even if one employer takes a principled moral stance and quits his job for morality reasons, you have a literal pool of people waiting to go be your advisor. So it's a temporary setback at most. Finally, let's talk about the big one, separatist sentiment. Now, this is not a pulse event, which means you can get separatist sentiment and also the pulse event simultaneously. Which means that since it's coded differently for some reason, again, Paradox coded this one differently, another thing that's different here is to get the separatist sentiment event, you need 101% overextension. So if you have 105 overextension, you don't actually get this event, which is quite interesting. Not that it matters in practice, it's just more of if you ever accidentally hit 100 overextension, you're going to get the other bad events. You're not going to get this one, so that's nice to know. Regardless, to get back more in terms of its actual applications, nothing too fancy here. This event happens, you're going to get plus 15 Unrest. When you're at low level of overextension, and in the early game, this is significantly more noticeable, since it can be what actually brings you over the edge into the realms of uprisings. And this is one of the things that causes a lot of the big fires, especially for new players getting overextension, is that they go from their country looking relatively stable to 120 overextension, then a couple separatist sentiments, then the newly conquered land rise-ups, their old conquered land rise up, and it's just a massive cascade of suffering for them. So yeah, it's certainly very important in the early game when your overextension is quite low. That plus 15 unrest is really going to matter, when in the early game the most unrest reduction you're going to get is like -3 from tolerance of true faith and -2 from some ideas or stability or something. The good news with this event, however, is when you get into the late game and you're stacking thousands of overextension, this kind of fades into the background. It becomes entirely irrelevant. Plus 15 unrest doesn't mean much when the province is already on 50. Nothing more substantial to say here. By the late game, when you have thousands of overextension, plus 15 unrest is a drop in the ocean. So, managing and mitigating overextension. It's all well and good and known about it, but how can you manage and deal with it? Well, first of all, let's mention this right away. In the last patch, Paradox added a new modifier for all of us modders and also, everyone playing the game, called Overextension Impact. One source of overextension impact that you can find in vanilla, if you have the Domination DLC, is if you are yet again in France, and you go down to the Dawn of Absolutism mission. If you do the L'État c'est moi path of the Court and Country disaster, so going to the disaster, you'll get overextension impact modified -10% until the end of the game. It's not bad, but it's also not really good. I mean, the alternative is Monopoly of Power for 20 years, which gives you admin efficiency, so I mean, I know which one I'm going to rather go for, but it's there if you want to play around with it. Another important thing to mention with this modifier, however, is it doesn't affect the actual events. It affects the overextension impact here. The effects of it are reduced by 10%. So, it's not bad, certainly. It's going to save you some corruption. It's going to save you some stab cost modifier, maybe even, but it's not going to get you back over the edge of 104 events. Which means come super late game when you're on a couple thousand, you go from 2,000 overextension to 1,900 effective overextension, whatever. And in the early game, well, it's not like you can go over 100 overextension anyway, so not that you're getting this one in the early game, to be clear, but still, something to bear in mind. It's not the greatest modifier, but it's there, and hence in an overextension video, I should probably mention it. So that mini side quest aside, let's talk about actually managing it. In the early game, vassals are your friends. They have a significant list of advantages. Early on, your points, especially admin, have a lot of things to be spent on, namely technologies and ideas. These things are still important late, sure, but you're probably not running a +5 admin advisor in 1448, hence by comparison, they're going to seem a lot less available. Furthermore, since you probably don't have your aforementioned ideas sorted, you probably won't have the corporation cost reductions that you'll have picked up later on in the game too. As such, vassals help you by immediately removing any overextension compared to having to wait for it to call, and it allows you to gain the cores on the provinces later at the cost of diplomatic power, something that tends to be more available in the early game from personal experience. Furthermore, vassals can also be useful by contributing troops to your wars in the early game, and while they certainly should not be relied upon, the AI is notorious for being very bad when it's fighting with you, and a genius when fighting against you, At the end of the day, they can go help siege surrounding provinces, can go be annoying to the AI, just, again, nice things to have on your side, and it's something that should not be discounted. What is worth mentioning with vassals as well is that sometimes when you get a vassal, and one of the more famous one that comes to mind is actually going to be Gascony. This is a very useful vassal for if you're eating into France. They have a lot of cores, so if you take something like Bordeaux, you can release Gascony there, then you can reconquest all of those provinces from France. And this is mainly another thing for the early game as well, but doing it this way saves you an incredible amount of aggressive expansion, and AE does matter in the early game. It matters a lot less in the late game when you're so big that the entire world of their coalition you will not be strong enough, but in the early game, yeah, this is going to be quite impactful, so make sure you use the Reconquest CB from your vassals as much as possible. You're saving yourself overextension, and you're saving yourself aggressive expansion as well. Then, after that, we start getting into the middle part of the game. You should still be using your vassals somewhat, but this is the part where you're going to have to start annexing. And the other thing to bear in mind is with the middle part of the game, this is the section where you are filling out your ideas. We've got a couple of them filled out. You've got your national ideas mostly sorted, if not fully completed. So you have your any core creation cost or province war score cost you're planning on getting early. You've already got that going. Your economy should also be a bit more substantial now, so if you're ready to face the challenges of chronic war and paying for +5 advisors, as well as a nationwide mandate on a courthouse in every province. So from this point, vassals start to become a lot less significant, since they start to bring in more problems than they solve. For example, annexing one gives you that -3 dip unless you run the nobility privilege, which means, again, you should probably start phasing them out of your plans. And in the final part of the game, and I'm going to include this from the point where admin efficiency comes into play, so absolutism and the admin tech that introduces admin efficiency, you really should be avoiding vassals like the plague. And a combination of province war score cost, admin efficiency, and even truce breaking means that where it's necessary, you can eat things like Europe within the span of a couple decades, and you don't need vassals here, because vassals are going to just set you back, costing you dip, which is a bit more important than admin in the early game, to annex, since again, you're going to have a lot of unlawful demands. And it's going to be very hard to annex them anyway, since you're going to have so much overextension that, well, you're going to have negative dip rep and improved relations for annexing the vassals in question. So to conclude, overextension. Not that bad before 100 overextension. While you should definitely avoid going over 100, let's be clear, you certainly can. But there's a correct way of going over 100 overextension. And a wrong. The wrong way is doing it by accident. Say you're playing someone like the Ottomans, you thought the Mamluks took a bunch of land, and you're like, I can go fight the Hungarians now. So you go and fight Hungary, you take a bunch of land from Hungary, and then you realize, I haven't finished coring the Mamluk land, I've taken all the stuff from Hungary, I have 190 overextension, no manpower, and I'm losing money. Oh no, 15 revolts rise up, I have 150k separatists with 50 force limit, again I'm out of manpower, I'm out of money, my country's on fire. That's bad. This is the bad overextension going over 100. That is bad, avoid that. What is the good way of going over 100 overextension? That can be summarized as being very aware and conscious that you're about to do it. Knowing that, yes, I haven't finished coring Mamlukland, but this is a good time to take Hungary before they get unionized by Austria or something like that. Or maybe this is a good time to attack Hungary because Poland will dishonor the call to arms. And yes, I can take all this land here, but I have the troops ready to fight the revolts in Syria. I have the troops on standby to fight the recent uprisings in Karaman. I have the troops ready to fight in Greece if that's necessary. I have the money to do that, I have the manpower to do that, that's fine. I'm going to take the 100 overextension, and I'm going to bear in mind that if I do that, I'm going to lose trade power in Crimea because it's a, it's a foreign node for me, so I'm going to take in the economic effects of that as well. If you've planned for the effects of overextension, going over 100 is not the end of the world. Again, it's just doing it blindly is a bad idea. But with all that said, I hope you learned something new today, and if you didn't, I hope you at least enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.